Hi, everybody. So I want to provide some context for this panel. Last fall, I read about some research about how the brain works, in particular about empathic thinking and analytical thinking. And when I read about the study, I just thought, wow, this is really notable, and we should talk about this. So I won't give away what the punchline is, but I think it's particularly important and relevant because we live in such an analytical world, especially in the tech world. We're all analytical minds. But in order to design technology that people want to use and technology that's relevant in people's lives, we have to cultivate empathic thinking so that we can better understand our users and design technology that works for them. So with that, I am pleased to invite and welcome Tony Jack from Case Western University, who was the researcher who did the study. And then following his introductory talk, we will have a conversation with Bradley and Jane about analytical thinking and empathic thinking. Okay. See.
Thank you very much for that introduction. Well, my work spans two very different fields, and I'm going to try and take you through them very quickly. Those fields are neuroscience and philosophy, with psychology in between. Brain imaging is mostly about mapping the brain. The way we do that is to give people more or less complicated tasks, and then we compare activity between the two tasks. And when we see a brain area is more active for the more complex task, then we assume that what must be going on is the brain area that comes up in the contrast is doing the extra cognitive processing involved. But more than a decade ago, scientists noticed something really rather odd. There were some brain areas which were more active the less difficult the task was. These areas are called the default network. These deactivations break the normal rules of brain mapping. Instead, they tell us something quite different, that our neural structure puts constraints on how we think. And the brain, in this way, is quite like other parts of our body. Take your arm, for instance. Your arm can move in many ways that allow it to do all sorts of different things. And evolution has designed a brilliantly flexible structure. But the arm still has constraints. If you have an itchy back, your arm is poorly designed to help with that. Instead of contorting your arm, you do much better to go and play nice with someone else. They're going to do a much better job. The problem the brain structure creates has some similarities to the problems of back scratching. In fact, these two problems involve essentially the same brain networks. One network we use to manipulate objects and another for social bonding. But the problem the brain generates is, I hope, a little bit more profound than the problem of back scratching. Philosophers love paradoxes, problems which are really hard to solve. They spend a lot of time thinking about how to solve these paradoxes. To many scientists, this seems like a waste of time. The way I see it, these really hard problems are actually the most valuable. The reason is that they reflect a clash between two different ways of thinking. And what cognitive science does is study how we understand the world. So if there's a clash between two ways of understanding, then we can expect to see it reflected in our psychology and even in our neural structure. Whatever we're doing, even when we just let our minds wander at rest, we see a constant fight between these two networks. Our brains maintain a dynamic equilibrium, constantly shifting from one network to the other, much as we shift our balance from one foot to the other when we move around. And this dynamic tension is relevant to all these philosophical dilemmas. But the problem which seems to be the most central is the problem of consciousness. The problem of consciousness is a tension between two types of understanding, a detached scientific mode of understanding and a different mode, a mode which allows us not just to understand but also to connect to the experiences of others. Do something for me. Stop for a moment to remember the time when you told your troubles to a friend or a mentor, a time when you felt truly listened to, truly understood. Well, you didn't feel that way because your mentor diagnosed an imbalance in your brain chemicals or because they knew how your neurons were firing. You felt that way because your mentor shared in your experience. Together, you breached the bubble of your solitary, isolated consciousness. What we've found is that when people think analytically, for instance, when they solve scientific puzzles or when they think about how the technical details of how something works, then we turn off the brain areas that allow us to understand other people's experience, that allow us to empathize. And on the other hand, when we empathize, we turn off the brain areas for analytic thinking. So this neural tension we've seen for over a decade, we now know reflects a cognitive tension between these two different modes of understanding. Okay, so what's that got to do with design, you might wonder? Well, I think good design takes both networks. It requires technical excellence, but it also requires that excellence be directed very clearly towards an excellent user experience. And it's that part that takes empathetic imagination. My research shows that people tend to be better at one thing or the other. You may not be that surprised to learn that women tend to be more empathetic and men better at analytic thinking. But in fact, it's not just a gender difference. That's only a small part of it. Even if you look just as men or just at women, you find that more analytic people tend to have less empathy and vice versa. We can train both of these networks. We can all learn to have more balanced minds. But it looks like a balanced mind comes at a cost. A lot of recent work suggests we can train our analytic spatial-visual skills by playing violent, fast-action video games. Ladies, you can actually catch up to men, average performance on spatial-visual tasks, by just 2 weeks of playing a violent, fast-action video game for an hour a day. I'm not sure if that's attractive, but it's an option. We can also, what we've been concerned with is that the Western world tends to train the analytic network, but we can also train the empathetic network. And a good way to do that, as this conference lays testament to, is through Eastern practices like yoga and meditation. So we actually measured the ability of people to recognize subtle facial expressions immediately before and after they had engaged in a yoga session. And what we found was that they got a lot better. And they got even better if they had been doing yoga for a long time or if they had a good flow experience in the yoga session. Then we measured people while they're playing video games at a LAN party. And we found that their performance got worse. Now, they got a lot better with the yoga than they did worse playing the spatial-visual, playing the fast-action video games. So I think what this is telling us is that you can get a big boost by training the brain, but it comes at a little bit of a cost. It comes at a cost to being excellent in just one domain. And these differences in ability get even more compounded when we're focusing on one specific issue. Because once we get used to thinking about one thing in a particular way, it gets harder and harder for us to see it in another way. So my work focuses on this in the context of how we think about people. If you start to think about people as objects, it gets harder and harder to think about their experiences. So doctors are trained to think of patients as complex biological machines that need to be fixed. And so it's little wonder that their bedside manner is often complained about. Similarly, when you consider many technical devices, it's clear that many of its features are there because some techie thought they were cool, without realizing the average end user will find them more irritating than useful. If you have a company dominated by people with a high aptitude for technical thinking, then that presents a problem. Actually, it's a double whammy. The first punch is that those people are going to have a lot more technical expertise than the average user. And it's much harder to understand someone else's experience the more different it is from yours. It takes more empathetic imagination to close that gap. The second punch is that if you're a technical thinker, and that's where your strengths are, then you have less of that empathetic imagination. So I think it's very good that Google employees use Google services, and that's definitely a step in the right direction. But I think it probably isn't enough. It's still going to be hard for an employee at Google to really understand what using a Google service is like for the average user. Great design creates things that become part of the fabric of our everyday life. Things like modes of transport, kitchen appliances, smartphones, and social media applications. But our brain is not merely something we incorporate into the fabric of our lives. It's the very cloth from which it's woven. The mind is the one object which all the things we design have to interact with. And it's also the object from which great designs originate. Great designers don't work in a vacuum. They understand what the constraints are. And to understand these constraints, the technical wizards need to listen to other voices, voices which can pull them out of the analytic focus and help them to see a bigger picture. And in practice, what I think that means is that at least one member of a small team who's more empathetic needs to have the social status to grab the attention of the group. And that brings me to my last point. By their nature, analytic people tend to be somewhat dismissive. On the other hand, empathetic people tend to have beliefs that can seem a little strange or irrational. So the more analytic you are, the less likely you are to be spiritual or to believe in God. And there's been a lot of papers that have shown that recently. But actually, we've found there's a much larger effect which goes in the other direction. The more empathetic you are, the more you are likely to be spiritual or religious. And also, the more likely you are to believe slightly curious things like in karma or in life after death, or that people have a soul. And as a scientist, I do find some of those things a little hard to swallow, but I think it's a distraction to get caught in the notion of whether these things are rational or not. Because my work suggests these ways of thinking are actually essential to preserving our humanity and particularly our kindness. So I think it's a mistake to focus too much on the hard facts to the exclusion of everything else, and that there's wisdom to allowing a little bit of mystery in our lives.
Thanks, Tony.
Thanks.
So now I'd like to take the conversation over to Bradley and Jane. And we'll start with Bradley. So Google is famous for its engineering culture and analytic approach to product development. And the term data-driven design historically was a mantra or a source of pride. So how does this culture manifest itself in the context of product development?
I've got to ask Tony a question first. You said it would take 2 weeks for a woman to catch up to a man, but you gave no time frame for how a man could, or if ever, a man could catch up to a woman.
In terms of empathy?
Yes.
Right.
Is it hopeless?
I don't think we've done a lot to develop good training programs. So most of our educational efforts are really focused on the analytic. But I mean, I think 2 weeks of an hour a day of yoga, and you could be getting there, Bradley.
We'll keep trying. By the way, I don't know if this was announced. Irene is my wife. So full disclosure. What was the question, dear?
And that is my husband. Tell us about how you use data to make informed decisions about product development.
So Google does famously acquire and utilize a lot of data in its product development process, and it is both a blessing and a curse. To be able to actually get a real-time pulse of, in terms of what in your product is actually working and what is failing for users, we really literally call it saving lives. And that sounds melodramatic, but the way we think about it is if your product is failing a user and they have to spend 3 minutes instead of 3 seconds navigating around to get the product to do what you want to, then you multiply that times 100 million users times 3 minutes, and you've literally squandered away lifetimes of what could have otherwise been productive, existence in the world while they're navigating your mistakes. We take it really seriously. We are literally returning back to people time, which is a really precious gift. So we look at that data, and what we try to understand is trends. And I think apropos to the conversation, we understand that our own usage is anomalous. It's very privileged in many, many senses. We have the nicest computers and the most bandwidth, and so we understand the process of what we call dog fooding, which is Googlers using their own Google products, is absolutely essential at some point in the process, but soon we have to let the product out in the wild. And what we learn in the wild is that people in Africa have very different computing environments, if at all, And people in other languages have different challenges with the translations we offer. And so the data is what allows us to take our best efforts in getting the product right out of the gate and understand where we need to improve. And so we're very attuned to that data, but it's not a slavish attunement. We sort of utilize it as part of the tools we have to understand where we've succeeded in serving our users and where we've failed and have more work to do.
Okay. So Jane, you're creative director at IDEO. And IDEO is, for those of you who aren't familiar, it's probably the most celebrated design firm in the world. And IDEO often credits its design process as its secret sauce and is one of the leading practitioners of empathetic design. And Jane, you've personally been a huge driving force behind developing the empathetic design process, which has been adopted and replicated in many, many other companies, including Google, I would say. And you've made it a core part of what the company does. So tell us, what is empathetic design, and can you give an example or two that illustrates what this process looks like and how it's benefited your clients and how it's played into product design?
Sure, yeah. Yes, we are a design company, so we primarily make stuff and build products, services, and put them out in the world with the concept of having a positive impact, making the world and people's lives better. We do rely on data and trends, but I would say we do have a core value in the culture at the company, and really a mindset, which is how I would describe empathetic design, empathic design, as we sometimes call it. And it's really about working hard to come at design and innovation opportunities from a place that's deeply and viscerally connected to the kinds of experiences that other people in the world are having. And when I say other people, I mean obviously that's the people who are going to interact with the things that we're putting out in the world, but it also relates to the way that we connect with our own design teams, because design teams are constituted of people from very different disciplines, from hardcore engineering or from computer science to social scientists to people who have had art training backgrounds in graphic design, for example. Also, we've found that to have any kind of impact in the world, we need to motivate our clients in addition to ourselves being super excited about these great ideas we have. And there needs to be enough sort of motivational energy to follow through and take these things out there through all the barriers that get thrown up to innovation and bringing new things to life in the world. So this approach is one, as you say, I've spent many years of my life working, certainly not single-handedly, but I think of it more as liberating a capacity that people have innately, which is this wonderful ability. It's just an exquisite capacity that all of us have to tune in to the kind of experience that other people are having, be it joy, be it misery, the whole range, whole gamut of human emotions. We can watch people, gather data, we can see and listen to what they have to say, but we also, as we're listening and watching what people are doing, are asking ourselves, what are they feeling? What are they thinking? What are they feeling? How can I make sense of what I'm actually seeing in the world in a way that helps me have greater insight? Maybe not data, maybe it's not true, but I'm developing some insight into what that person's experience is like. You'd asked about an example. I'd love to share an example from some recent work, just to make it tangible. We were working with Bank of America, who were interested to attract more boomer-aged women to open accounts with them. And they had lots of data. They had lots of data about what the kind of accounts were that boomer women would want to engage with. But we decided what we could bring to the process was something we could get a little deeper. So we spent time with women in their homes, talking about money, going through some of the processes of balancing checkbooks and so on. And not surprisingly, we discovered a lot of angst and stress around dealing with money. But it was quite interesting. One of the designers came back with a story about just a moment where he had seen a real moment of sort of joy and of success. And where this came from was a woman who was going through her bills, and she was paying by check, on paper still. She would always round up the bill amount to a round figure. And this was a little sort of moment of joy. And he inquired a little bit about what that was about. And she'd never really thought about it before because it was just a little thing. But as she realized, she did enjoy doing that. And what it was about was always feeling like she was accumulating credit and they were never going to catch her out. And there was this thing about being in control of this thing about money that always seems to be controlling us. And so there was a little empathic moment of recognition from the designer. But importantly, he brought that story back into the domain of the design team. And in telling that story, there's a kind of reflection that occurs through empathy, and other people begin to abstract that to a certain pattern. And we realized that there were lots of instances in people's behavior with money that was this kind of just a little bit, but I'll save this bit of change from my cup of coffee and I'll put that in the jar, and that's going towards our holiday or school uniforms or some way of saving in a really, really painless way. It's only pennies or cents. And that insight led us to, there's something going on here. What if we could get Bank of America to think about developing a scheme, a program, which would actually help people save? So I don't know if you're familiar, but the outcome of that, many months later, probably even a year later, was Keep the Change program, which is one where it's a debit card that rounds up. And Bank of America incentivizes you to take that because they'll match for a few months anyway the little savings that you make by rounding up on every purchase you make. And it's been phenomenally successful for them. It's almost been like in the financial industry, something of a game changer, where we've actually managed to align a bank's needs with consumers' needs in a very sensitive way, and they've done pretty well out of that. But it wouldn't have got there with just empathy. There was a lot of analytical thinking went into how does this become a business for Bank of America? How do we actually make this work, and what do the numbers look like, and so on.
I mean, one thing I really enjoyed about that example is that it's not just looking at the behavior and doing the statistics on it, but there's also this moment where you've got to go deeper to understand the emotional drive that's leading to the behavior. And I guess I would see that as more true empathy that goes beyond the sort of social thinking that has dominated actually psychology and obviously maybe the business world too, where a lot of statistics are collected. But is there the human insight behind it?
Right.
Yeah. So Bradley runs product management for Google+, and one of the tenets of Google has always been focused on the user and all else will follow. So how does Google focus on the user? And as Google has gone into social media where you have to be more sensitive to people's emotions and needs, how has Google's thinking and approach changed in terms of focusing on users?
I think, as Tony was just saying, the products we're building now are not just utilities. They don't just help you do things faster. They connect people to people. For those of you that saw Gopi's talk this morning, you can see some of the amazing experiences that people are having on our platform, finding each other, connecting with each other, looking at each other in the eye. And it's really heartwarming and authentic. And I think it has changed the way we think about the product at Google, because we're no longer cut off from our users. We're no longer sort of shipping software under the door and then getting data back. We're present with them. And so on our service, we're able to engage with those users, to talk to them. They reach out to us. We watch what they're doing in a primary sense, and it's really visceral. You actually get to hear the cries when something's not working and people are upset around a policy change or a change in the interface, and you have to have some discrimination to know whether that's just change aversion, which is a real thing, or a real mistake that you've made that needs addressing. And you also get to hear the stories that touch you and move you and remind you that what you're doing is more than building a tool. You're helping people bridge time and space and make connections of the heart in ways that couldn't otherwise happen. And we see those stories again and again every day. And so I think more than any other product I've worked on, the user isn't sort of an abstract thing. The user is well known to us, and we're in dialogue with the user and able to adapt our thinking in real time based on that connection that we have.
So Tony mentioned how yoga and meditation cultivate empathic thinking. So Jane, your book, Thoughtless Acts, to me, it exemplifies mindfulness in the design process. So I was wondering if you could please tell us a little bit about this book and share your perspective.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. I should say the name of this book is Thoughtless Acts, which makes it sound kind of like that might be about carelessness. It's quite the opposite. What I really meant by this title, Thoughtless Acts, was about actions that are more without thought, like things that happen in a more intuitive way. Can we have the slides? I can show a few images from the book, because it's important, because it's all pictures. The whole point of this book was to try to get people, including our own designers and clients and anybody in the world, to slow down a little bit and just look at some of the things that happen in the world that can inform us about the kind of experience that other people are having. So it's all images with no captions except in the back if you kind of want to cheat and have a look. But the point about it is really just to notice how intuitively we behave in the world and think about what we might learn about that for design. So even in this case, as you're looking now, just a simple thing like navigating through space, through the subway in Tokyo, the cues that we use to help us make sense of space. Here, a violinist who's found shelter and a music amplifier all in one in this little tunnel. How we think and notice forms that match, like this empty bottle of milk that just perfectly matches that pillar. You can imagine walking around with this empty bottle, one can, wondering where to put it, and then you see the just perfect place to put it. We recognize these things without thinking, particularly. The van we went out in London as an exercise just to see what we would see, just for an hour. Let's just take images. And one of my colleagues took this picture of the van, and, well, what's that about? Well, if you look very, very carefully on the dashboard, there's a cup of coffee sitting inside a roll of masking tape to support it. And it's like, whoa, you are really tuned into this stuff, you know. From a distant bridge, she's noticing things like this. So my point was that this sort of lens that we put on the world changes how we see and what we see. And this is a little test to practice that. Many of the things that we observe are super economical, like just wrapping a piece of string around your cup so that the paper doesn't get into your tea. You probably all have your own technique for this. Or just making use of downtime in the airport. Some very functional things. This is very pre-Google Maps. This was the delivery guy in London with his heads-up display. And my friend Nana in Tokyo, who used her phone actually as a sort of, she decorated it as a social tool. You know, it was all the people that she has got the numbers for in that device. It was just very sweet, speaking about what it meant to her. Sometimes the same object used in really different ways to signal different things, like please put your litter here in a Japanese park, or don't bother putting your money here in Berkeley, California. Things we do because we remember our own rituals and how we can not forget this time to take this and drop our letters in the mail. And sometimes just our relationships with people. I love this image, which is of a mother with her daughter looking at the exam results from the end of year. And you see how she's just stooped down to meet the same eye level, so they're looking at the world from the same perspective. I just think it's beautiful. And if I have just a minute, I would run into, this is not a big example, but taking this sort of world observation into an example. If we look at children, we see they have a totally different relationship with space and furniture than the rest of us. We were invited by IKEA to help design for children to store their toys and such. You know, kids leave their toys everywhere, and couldn't we make tidying up more fun and better for the family? And IKEA knows a lot about storage, so they had a lot of imagination of what that might be like. But my colleague who was working on this project noticed this about children and had a go himself, literally looking at the world from their point of view, connecting with their experience. And he came up with this as a solution. Now, this is not an important thing in the world, but it's just a rather sweet thing when you see how it works. And that's it, just tapping into what are other people experiencing.
Thank you.
They can go.
So, Bradley and Jane, your respective companies represent a range of approaches to product design and development, and both companies are highly successful and innovative. And you've both talked about the importance of empathic thinking and analytical thought, and yet Tony's research suggests that you can't really have it both ways, or that it's very hard for a single person to activate both parts of the brain that way. So what kind of advice would you give to leaders of organizations that are inclined towards one approach but want to strike the right balance?
I think my experience is that there are people that I have met and admire greatly, and they are rare and valued, that can build these bridges between those parts of their brain. Like, as I think about someone like Andy Hertzfeld, who was one of the original Macintosh designers, and we also worked together on Google Plus's original design, he's someone who is able to sort of build these bridges between empathic thinking and analytical thinking. But they're rare, and you can't aspire to hire a company the size of Google that every individual is this amazing unicorn, to use your word. They're very rare, and so you get as many of those as you can through as aggressive recruiting and reaching out to all the unlikely places where you would find such people. Once you've sort of tapped out on that approach, I think what you strive for is diversity, and acknowledging that you're not going to get these, unicorns. What you need to do is get, I don't know what the example would be, horses and rhinos or something like that. But you get people who are excellent at what they do and open-minded enough to embrace the value of others. So I think diversity is not creating an adversarial environment where you sort of have the analytics in one camp and the empathic people over on the other side of the room. You try to get a good blend of skill sets and a huge amount of respect in the process for what each of those skills bring to the table. That's what we've tried to do at Google. We focus a lot on diversity, both in the traditional sense, but also, I think, in terms of appreciating unique perspectives and the ability for everyone to contribute something, because we're trying to build products that serve humanity. And we recognize that people live in different places and different cultures and different languages, and in order to live up to that mission, we can't have a monoculture that sort of, imposes our product on the rest of the world. We have to be resonant with what's actually happening for people. And so I would say our answer is diversity.
Okay. How about you, Jane?
I agree with everything you said, and I think we map similarly in those ways. I think I would add an important aspect, and I think it comes out in what you wrote too, that some of this may be innate and some may be learned. Some of the distinction and facility and capacity in one versus the other. But in my experience, a culture or conditions where there's permission to access one or the other, people actually have both. I mean, we have two sides of our brain. We are capable of both. I think most of the organizations that we work with, and probably partly because of the message we put out in the world, tend to be over-indexed on the analysis side. And so we have something unique to offer them because we really press this empathy side. But my experience has been that given the conditions and invited to slow down and to observe and be curious about your own behavior and be curious about other people's behavior, people have amazing resources in empathy, but it needs to be given a space and a place and respected, maybe talked about. So, I've seen some highly analytical organizations. My favorite is Air New Zealand. You can imagine what an airline company has to be pretty strong on the analysis side to keep things flying on time, and they have an extremely good record. But their CEO models empathy so beautifully. He, on a regular basis, acts as cabin crew, ticket seller, serves meals on planes. He goes and helps the baggage handlers. He works with the maintenance team. He invites those people to come and be CEO with him for the day. And this is Rob Fife of Air New Zealand, just to give him his due. He has created a remarkable culture where the analysis and precision is extremely highly valued, but this human-to-human connection that he's perpetuated through his organization is stellar and beautiful. So I think it's a lot about culture and modeling by leaders.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So, Tony, what suggestions might you have, like strategies for people that they can take in general to kind of create a seamless transition between their analytical mind and their empathetic mind?
I mean, I think the other members of the panel have much more expertise in how to make a business work well, but I think these observations are very interesting, and I would love to say a little bit about what we now understand is going on in the brain. I mean, it's quite true that we all have both of these networks, and we're cycling between them all the time. And what we think is really the key to sort of keep excellent performance is that you move fluidly between them, and that you move at the right moment. So you're applying the right network to deal with the right problem. So I think there may be one issue, which is fluency between them. Another interesting thing is, creativity. There's a lot of work on creativity. And it turns out that, people vary in how much tension they have between these networks. If you do focused meditation, it actually increases the tension between these networks. But it turns out that people who are very high in creative achievement have somewhat less tension between these networks. And I think that's because they're blending some sort of intuitive, emotional way of understanding with an analytic way of understanding. But that's also a little bit worrying because it may be very delicate balance to get that quite right, because although we know that creativity is associated with having less tension between those networks, that's just about the only good thing that is. So just about every mental disorder that you could list, including autism, schizophrenia, ADHD, just simply being extremely tired, being depressed, and the list goes on. All of these have as a key signature that you're not alternating a lot between these. So I think creativity is so interesting because it's such a precious thing, and yet it may be a very unstable thing. And there's obviously a lot of history of people who are highly creative having family members with mental disorders or having periods of at least low productivity and perhaps mental disorders themselves. So I think I really like this suggestion that Bradley made that if you have a culture where there's a lot of respect for these different perspectives, it may be that blending these two in an individual is a little bit unstable. I mean, it's great if someone achieves it, but it may be a little bit unstable. But if you can have, as you say, not divided camps, but respect between the camps, then you have other people to pull you out and to help you see the other view. So it seems to me, though, that I'm not sure I'm really making suggestions, but rather just backing up what you say you have in practice, right?
I think that's a really important thing to think about individuals and groups of people, because in the world that I inhabit, the creative individual, I mean, we have some, but they unfortunately maybe rarely get to be creative on their own, absolutely. They need to bring along a team, they need to bring along a client, they need to bring along a client's organization to actually make something happen. So there's something in the world of design that goes beyond just being creative, which is about going on that journey together with a group of people. And so the idea that there are people who are stronger on one side or on the other comes into play when we have people who are looking at an issue or perspective from multiple different points of view. And I think that makes innovation harder, but it also makes it better. It makes the things that get out into the world stronger and better, as you can prove.
Yeah, I have a question for Bradley relating to that. So I mean, it's clear from what Jay was saying that they really prize this empathy, and that's. I just wonder, from a distance, I know nothing about Google really, right, apart from using it every day. In your culture,
we know a lot about you.
Yeah, that wasn't very empathetic.
There you have it.
In your culture, because it seems to be one of the dangers is that cultures get stuck in one mode. It's like only one thing is prized. And I would have thought in the Valley that it would be easy to prize analytic above all else. And does Google sort of actively counteract that in terms of how it prizes what its employees are doing?
Very much so. I mean, on this stage over this weekend, I think we have 5, 6 people from Google that will be here. And it's really, I think, an artifact of our founders, who themselves are really these kinds of Renaissance people that are really aspiring to very high and lofty goals, I think, as most, in comparison to most businesses. And, Larry and Sergey were both Montessori educated and are very deep, interesting, committed people. And Google, as a place to work, we're sort of famously, usually number one in terms of all the polls, the best place in America to work, best place in the world to work. That's not just about free food and, nice perks and benefits. The real benefits are the cultural benefits and the mission-oriented benefits of doing something that matters, and it aspires to these higher oriented goals, and it attracts people that resonate with that, and it retains people that resonate with that, and it's very deliberate. Some of the people on this stage are part of our people operations, which in itself sounds sort of analytical, but our people operations team are those that really help create the cultural artifacts at Google, which are subtle and deliberate and important to the culture that we've created. As an example, this is not exactly the same as the CEO of Air New Zealand, but we have a tradition at Google called TGIF, which Larry and Sergey get on stage, and any question is fair game. Someone can walk up to the microphone and ask about our policy in China and why did we choose to do this, or complain that the sesame bagels were not delivered on time this morning in the cafeteria. From the sublime to the ridiculous. But that approachability and that respect, each question is received and answered in a serious way, I think speaks to the kind of culture we're creating, where respect for the individual and the whole of the person is what makes Google the best place in the world to work. It's not just about the perks you can put in a chart. It's about the feeling we cultivate at the company for its employees.
Okay. So we're out of time, but Tony, Jane, Bradley, thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today.
Thank you,
Irene.